Okay, so welcome to the 5th video for the 4th meditation, I think. In this video, we're going to talk about how we can avoid error. So, what are the correct uses of the will according to Descartes? Well, there are going to be two correct uses of the will that contribute to the avoidance of error, where if we're using the will in this way, we cannot go wrong. We cannot fall into error. We cannot fall into privation. The first he calls the freedom of indifference, and the second he calls the spontaneity of the will with clear and distinct perceptions. So first, let's look at the freedom of our will to pursue or avoid, affirm or deny, the freedom of indifference, what he calls the freedom of indifference. So the evidence for the will and its freedom of indifference first arose in the first meditation. Why? Well, there we registered the impulse to affirm what comes from the senses. The fact that we can resist this impulse shows our freedom of indifference, right? So the fact that we could withhold our assent and stop our judgment, right? The fact that we could resist the temptation to judge that the senses are presenting things correctly was exhibit A for our freedom of indifference. And that's the first way in which we can avoid error. So it's in the first meditation when we see that I can suspend my belief in my sitting by the fire, that I get an example of this freedom of indifference. And here in meditation 4, we see that I'm indifferent in those cases where my will extends past the intellect, where my will extends past the intellect. So let's say intellect. Okay, what does that mean? Well, these are going to be cases when I'm not compelled by clear and distinct perception. So what he means by intellect, when he says that the will extends past the intellect, is he must mean the intellect in a restricted sense, in a more narrow sense than he was using it above, where the intellect is just the faculty for any old ideas. Rather, the intellect here must mean those ideas that I have clearly and distinctly. Those ideas that are like God's ideas, those ideas that are in the intellect and in my intellect in the way that I have an intellect like God's intellect. So in these cases, when the will extends past my clear and distinct ideas to my ideas that are obscure and confused, right? In relation to those ideas, well, the will not be compelled to judge. The will not be compelled to judge. And in those cases, right, when I'm not compelled, I can exercise my freedom of indifference and suspend judgment, not make the judgment. I'm indifferent. I'm indifferent in these cases. Nonetheless, the perfection of the will is a higher state than indifference. Indifference is mere ignorance, right? Indifference is mere ignorance. It's a weakness. It's a negation. Right? It's a negation. And so the perfection of the will is a higher state than mere indifference. I mean, you know, my cat is indifferent in some ways, maybe. My cat doesn't know algebra, right? There's negation about my cat's knowledge of algebra. My cat is indifferent to algebra, ignorant of algebra. But the will attains a higher state, a state of perfection, when it cannot but judge. When it cannot but judge. And that happens when there's clear and distinct perception. And he'll say, I mean, he says at one point, a great light in the intellect is followed by a great, what is it, force, compulsion? I should look up the quote. In the will, right? And sometimes he'll call this a state of spontaneity, And this is a higher state than the state of indifference. This is a state where you cannot but affirm the thing that's perceived clearly and distinctly, right? So be careful, though. Spontaneity here is not like spontaneously deciding to go to Bermuda for the weekend. It's not capricious, whimsical action. Rather, spontaneous action is when your free will reaches spontaneity when it considers an idea that it cannot but affirm. So the perfection of the free will is to affirm I am, I exist, and not be able to help doing so. It happens by necessity. It happens by necessity. It's so clear and lucid, I am, I exist, that you cannot but say yes. Right? You have to affirm I am, I exist when you understand the idea. You can't help but do so. And that is a higher position, right? That is knowledge. That is knowledge. And that is a higher state than mere negation, right? That's a perfected state. You've taken up a position that's stable, that's not going to change, you know, the next you know, whimsy that comes along, right? It's perfected, it's stable, it's taken up a position. Whereas error is unstable. Error will constantly be challenged, will constantly, you know, come into friction with your other positions, your other beliefs, because it's wrong. It's wrong. And so it's unstable. It hasn't taken up a position, but knowledge is perfected. Knowledge has taken up a position. It's stable. Okay. So let's turn now to the problem of freedom and necessity. I mean, so maybe let's do that in the next video. So we're gonna have a lot of little videos on meditation for it. Well, let's stop this video and we'll turn to the problem of freedom and necessity in the next.